Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a real pleasure to speak once again to the Legion of the Sons of St. Philip Neri. The Colombian philosopher Nicolas Gomez Davila said, quote, "The media today allow the modern citizen to find out about everything without understanding anything." Getting on to 70 years ago, there was a man, a Jesuit named Teilhard de Chardin, and he had a dream of a kind of planetary brain, a global consciousness where all people, like disciplined ants, would merge into a single thought form. Sadly, at the time, many Catholics thought this was a poetic and beautiful vision of the faith in the modern world. But what Teilhard de Chardin took as poetry at that time is engineering today. Because we now have the internet, social media, and so-called artificial intelligence, algorithms are the new prophets. They tell you what to watch on Netflix, what to buy on Amazon, and even what to think about on TikTok. What seemed like progress is in fact a form of gnosis. The old gnosis, disguised as binary code. In this talk, I'm going to look at news media in particular. And I'm going to explore how modern mass media has a structural purpose, which is psychological warfare. It is a tool of the enemies of the church to alienate us from communion with Christ the King. And that's, of course, something that we're instinctively aware of. But what I want to lay out is some of the steps we can take to notice this when we interact with media, which is inevitable in today's world. So if you think back to the age of the newspapers and the radio, the world of the 20th century in particular, those forms of mass communication had a structural purpose. So it doesn't matter whether you were reading the Daily Mail or the Guardian or the Telegraph, the Times, the Financial Times, they were all there ultimately to consolidate support for the nation state. So you could have different views on the general strike or on imperial preference, but you would be buoyed into supporting the British war effort in both of the world wars. And that was the same throughout all the European countries. It was this means of mobilizing the masses for the projects of the nation state. And so modern mass media has a structural purpose as well. We're going to look at how this is. First of all, I'm going to look at the sociological context. Then we're going to look at the political and cratological context, from the word cratologia, meaning the logic of power. From the point of view of the crypto-oligarchy, who are behind the pseudo-democracies that we live in today. We're going to take a little bit of a route through papal teaching on modern media, preconciliar papal teaching, which is very illuminative, is as fresh today as when it was promulgated. And then we're going to look at some of the techniques of psychological manipulation so that we can be on our guard against those forms of propaganda which are incessantly bombarding us today. So we're going to look at the facet of media quantity, which is characteristic of post-modernity. We're going to look at media velocity, the speed with which we are afflicted by media messages. And then we're going to look at media qualities or techniques of this psychological manipulation, which ultimately is a form of idolatry procurement. That's the contention that I am going to advance here. Before finishing with, as Charles indicated, what can be done? What do we do in this environment? So why should we understand the media at all if it's such a dangerous form of manipulation by the enemies of the church. Why should Catholics even seek to understand it? For anybody who's studied the history of Vatican II, you might have seen how there was what Ratzinger called the Council of the Media that ran in parallel to the Ecumenical Council itself. And he used it as a bit of a scapegoat to distance the actual actors like himself from the revolutionary changes that took place. But there was a lot of truth to it as well. Modernist figures like Hans Kung, John Courtney Murray, Yves Congar, and other Periti were given massive exposure and positive publicity throughout the course of the 4 sessions by all forms of Western media, basically, particularly Time magazine and the American newspapers were incessant in elevating and lionizing these men. Meanwhile, traditionalists like Cardinal Ottaviani were dragged through the mud. The Holy Office had its reputation castigated by these media outlets. And these magazines framed Vatican II as a struggle between progressives and conservatives. The praise the liberals received and the smear campaign the Orthodox clergy were on the receiving end had the effect within the council of making some council fathers rethink their views, question their views on certain positions. As David Wemhoff has documented, he's the author of a very important book called John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, CIA and the American Proposition, which is all about this American media psychological warfare operation during the Second Vatican Council. He shows with empirical evidence that this was a psychological operation concocted by the US deep state, and it had the effect of deceiving attendees into thinking, into attendees and also the Catholic public, into thinking that the dissidents, the heretics, and the documents they influenced weren't so bad after all, that this was the right side of history. We can reflect on how, if the hierarchy had dutifully warned the laity worldwide in the years and decades prior to the council that the regime media was not to be trusted at all, since it was controlled by Freemasonry and the synagogue, then the Catholic public wouldn't have accorded it that authority and credibility in their reporting that the Catholic public did in going along with the revolution. The pre-conciliar hierarchy were too wary, too cautious to fully confront the Masonic intelligence agencies, the power of the American empire, and the synagogue. And then the price was paid by all of us. It's an example, I think, of the quixotic view of media, the rotten fruits that can result. Our Lord, of course, told us to love our enemies, not pretend that we don't have them. In his letter to Titus, St. Paul warns the Christians to heed not Jewish fables. Modern media, I'm going to argue, is a giant storytelling machine of Judeo-Masonic tyranny. Next slide, please. So let's, the previous slide, I wanted to put another point on that star, but the AI software wouldn't allow me to do that. So let's look at the sociological context, the conditions by which mass media has such purchase. Pope Pius XII gave a number of, every year he gave Christmas radio messages. And there were 2 particularly interesting ones in the Second World War, which were looking ahead to the world that would emerge after this global conflagration. In his 1942 Christmas radio message, he talked about a social order which is merely mechanical. A mass without inner cohesion is incapable of stability. He said that, quote, society must be organic, composed of members united according to their proper functions, coordinated and harmonized into a living whole. The individual, isolated and uprooted, is powerless, but when inserted into the organic structure of society, he finds protection, freedom, and dignity. This is what various sociologists have referred to as organic society or traditional society. Ferdinand Tönnies, for example, spoke of a Gemeinschaft. The blessing of the wheat fields in Artois is a depiction of this kind of society. The only kind of society the church recognizes, organic society. This is a Gesellschaft, a mass, atomized, individuated, anonymous. In his 1944 Christmas radio message, Pius XII developed this theme. He said, quote, "A democracy which ignores or suppresses the organic articulation of society degenerates inevitably into tyranny of the mass. The people, so true people, live and move by virtue of the richness of their organic structure." It comes from below. The mass is inert and lends itself to be dominated. Hence follows a first conclusion with its practical consequence. The true res publica does not contain in itself and does not mechanically bring together in a given territory a shapeless mass of individuals. It is and should be in practice the organic and organizing unity of a real people. The people and a shapeless multitude, or a mass, are two distinct concepts, two utterly different ways of being human, of living in a social world. The people lives and moves by its own energy. The masses are inert of themselves and it can only be moved from outside. The people lives by the fullness of life in the men who compose it, each of whom, at his proper place and in his own way, is a person conscious of his own responsibility and of his own views. This is a theme that the Church's social theorists have developed and elaborated for centuries. Bishop von Kettler talked about how intermediary associations, once they perish, despotism or anarchy inevitably follows. The intermediary associations of regions, municipalities, guilds, voluntary associations, families ultimately. These are forms of mediation between the state and the individual. And they have been devastated by revolution over 2 centuries now. Cardinal Louis Billot notes on the organic state that we are minded to think of the human body as an ensemble of cells. The family is the cell of society, that's true. But these cells are themselves organized into organs, which have functions in the social body. And this is the corpus politicum, which was so beloved of medieval social theorists. John of Salisbury, in his Polycratus in 1159, extended this metaphor. He said that the king was like the body's head, the priest was the soul, the councillors were the heart, the eyes, the ears, and the tongue were the magistrates of the law. One hand, the army, held a weapon, the other, without a weapon, was the realm's justice. The body's feet were the common people. Each member of the body had its vocation, and each was beholden to work in harmony for the benefit of the whole body. So back to Pius XII, he warned in 1944 the brink of the triumph of the democracies of the West, that the masses wait for the impulse from the outside. They're an easy plaything in the hands of anyone who exploits their instincts and impressions, ready to turn today this flag, tomorrow another. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he toured the infant United States of America, there's some seats at the front as well for any newcomers. Your quote's coming up a bit later, Charles, so you'll be here for that. He noticed in this infant democratic republic, quote, after having thus taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp, he's talking about the risk of a democratic despotism. The government extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, it enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrial animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Dissociation or desocialization is a universal phenomenon in the West today. In 2005, Britons spent apparently nearly an hour and a half a day socializing on average. In 2025, it was half an hour a day. That's the space into which the media can inject itself. Next slide, please. Jacques Ellul was quite a strange intellectual figure, called himself a Christian anarchist. But his book on propaganda is insightful, picking up some of the themes, some of the points that Pope Pius XII made, how a mass society is susceptible to propaganda. He said, quote, "For propaganda to succeed, a society must first have two complementary or paradoxical qualities. It must be both an individualist and a mass society. It is believed that an individualist society, in which the individual is thought to have a higher value than the group, tends to destroy groups that limits the individual's range of action, whereas a mass society negates the individual and reduces him to a cipher. But this contradiction is purely theoretical and a delusion. In actual fact, an individualist society must be a mass society, because the first move towards liberation of the individual is to break up the small groups that are an organic fact of the traditional society. In this process, the individual frees himself completely from family, village, parish, or brotherhood bonds, only to find himself direct vis-à-vis the entire society. When individuals are not held together by local structures, the only form in which they can live together is in an unstructured mass society. The individual left to himself is defenceless, the more so because he may be caught up in a social current, thus becoming easy prey for propaganda. As a member of a small group, he was fairly well protected from collective influences, customs, and suggestions in traditional society. He obeyed only if his entire group obeyed. An individual, however, can be influenced by forces such as propaganda, only when he is cut off from membership in local groups. For example, it is much more difficult today for outside propaganda to influence a soldier who's integrated into a military group or a militant member of a monolithic party than to influence the same man when he is a mere citizen. Thus, for propaganda to be effective, psychologically and sociologically, a combination of demographic phenomena is required. The first is population density, with a high frequency of diversified human contacts, exchanges of opinions and experiences. The second is urban concentration, which, resulting from the fusion between mass and crowd, gives the mass its psychological and sociological character. The stability of the peasantry is one of the reasons why this group is relatively unaffected by propaganda. He was writing here in 1963, when there was still perhaps something of the remnants, a peasant society in parts of France. He says, Goebbels himself realized that the peasants could be reached only if their structured milieu was shattered, and the difficulties that Lenin experienced in integrating the Russian peasantry into the pattern of the revolution are well known. The buying of a TV set, though an individual act, inserts the individual into the psychological and behavioral structure of the mass. The same could be said today, of course, of the smartphone or the Twitter account. So there's this process, the dissolution of traditional societies, and then the coagulation into a mass, which is then manipulable by the oligarchs. Next slide. So the mass, once realized, receives their reality, their entire reality, through mass media. Atomization and massification has made reliance on mass media to build a picture of the world even more acute. As a result, the mass cannot discern real events and revelations from things like UFOs or NASA space missions. If the government were to, for example, order state-employed NHS staff to run around in hazmat suits as a result of a seasonal cold virus, then you could convince the mass the outside world is toxic to them and to stay indoors. We all remember how the mass were engineered into panicking over death rates that were lower than almost every year before 2010. The highest inflated figure the regime could muster by shutting down the health service and leaving old people to die alone in their homes was a death rate equivalent to the UK in 2003. Age-standardised all-cause mortality in England and Wales in 2020 was the worst since only 2008, a year notorious for absolutely no global or UK pandemic whatsoever. The whole thing was a simulation, driven by media propaganda and fraudulent COVID testing. But what's worse is the mass had access to this information. They could have stopped to think, why is the deadliest pandemic, quote unquote, in modern history statistically less deadly than just living normally in 2003? But they didn't, because the mass are passive, foolish, and habitual sinners. They are playthings for the enemies of the church that run the crypto oligarchies. So, of course, I'll come on to hyperreality later, but in a certain sense, there was a pandemic, not epidemiologically, but psychologically, in the perceptions of people. It was a mind virus. And for those that are practicing occult techniques, that's what they're looking for. Next slide, please. So these are two of the sort of standout papal encyclicals from before the Council on modern media. The first is Pius XI's Vigilanti Cura, which is on cinema and particularly praises the Legion of Decency in the United States for enforcing moral standards on Hollywood. But Pius XI notes in that encyclical, a people who in time of repose give themselves to diversions which violate decency, honour or morality, to recreations which, especially to the young, constitute occasions of sin, are in grave danger of losing their greatness and even their national power. Everyone knows what damage is done to the soul by bad motion pictures. They are occasions of sin. They seduce young people along the way of evil by glorifying the passions. They show life under a false light. It's kind of dream world. They cloud ideals. They destroy pure love, respect for marriage, affection for the family. They are capable also of creating prejudices among individuals and misunderstanding among nations, among social classes, among entire races. Pius XII picked up papal teaching on modern media in 1957, the year before he died, with Miranda Prorsus, which extended this teaching to the relatively new medium of television and the radio. Pius XII notes about news media in there, quote, "News of any event, even if nothing but the bare fact is related, has yet an aspect of its own which concerns morality in some way. This aspect affecting human morals must never be neglected, for news of any kind provokes a mental judgment and influences the will." So there should be signs in cinemas about the degree of psychological impact the Gesamtwerk, the whole artistic production that the person's about to subject themselves to is going to have. This is what Pius XII is recognising. Contra the lies of liberalism, there's such a thing as neutrality. Just the intonation and way and priority that the news is presented is going to have a psychological inchoate effect on the audience. In 1954, Pius XII wrote to the bishops of Italy, "Should we not shudder when we reflect attentively that through television shows all can inhale, even within the home, the poisoned air of those materialistic doctrines which diffuse empty pleasures and desires of all kinds, just as was done over and over again in motion picture theatres. On the radio," he said, quote, "those who listen to the radio are duty-bound to discriminate carefully and intelligently among the various programmes, which should not be allowed to enter the house pell-mell, but should be given the same thoughtful and prudent invitation that you would extend to a friend. It would be wrong to admit acquaintances indiscriminately into your house. So too, the radio programs you admit should be such as to encourage truth and goodness, and will not distract members of the family from the fulfillment of their duties to individuals or society, end quote. That's directly applicable to modern podcasts, or slopcasts, as some of them sadly descend to. We have to discriminate and be careful about how much time we actually allow ourselves to have these strangers into our home, into our ears. On the cinema, Pius XII said, "Human nature's condition is such, in fact, that not always do the spectators possess or preserve the spiritual energy, the interior detachment, and frequently too the strength of will to resist a captivating suggestion, and thus the capacity to control and direct themselves." Next slide, please. The really interesting papal teaching I found was actually a speech that Pius XII gave in 1950 to Catholic news editors directly on public opinion, because you could see how he was following his sociology that he presented in those radio addresses during the 1940s. He said to those media leaders, quote, "What is called public opinion today is often nothing more than a name devoid of meaning, something like a vague rumor, an artificial and superficial impression, nothing like a spontaneous echo awakened in the conscience of society and emanating from it. Add to this the abuse of power by gigantic mass organizations, which, chaining modern man in their intricate machinery, coldly stifle all spontaneity of public opinion and reduce it to a blind and docile conformity of ideas and judgments. Modern man readily adopts independent and outgoing stances, what he thinks are independent and outgoing stances. These are, most of the time, nothing but a facade behind which poor, empty, inconsistent beings hide, lacking the strength of spirit to unmask the lie, lacking the strength of soul to resist the violence of those who skillfully know how to set in motion all the springs of modern technology, all the refined arts of persuasion, to strip them of the freedom of thought and make them like fragile reeds shaken by the wind." Matthew 11:7. So we're all reeds shaken by the wind to some degree today. We're going to look at the way in which the wind tries to destroy us and how we can resist that. Next slide, please. So this is where Charles, he's going to maybe miss his axiom here, but he said, Charles Coulomb, "We live in plutocratic oligarchies today, enforced and managed by tyrannies, called for by democracies." It's the anti-type form of the Aristotelian mixed regime, the very worst possible conceivable hybrid. And these oligarchies, in the context of massification, of course, use information as a means of subjugation. Plato, in his Republic, talks about the absurdity in democracies of worshipping that which 50% plus one take to be valuable or beautiful or truthful. But such is the modern mythology around so-called democracy. People internalize this and become easily warped and manipulated, becoming herd animals, easier to manage for the dominant oligarchs. And media is that mechanism of controlling public opinion. So if we're talking about democratic or pseudo-democratic contexts, mass media is more important, still more important. Next slide, please. Aristotle, in his Republic, in Book 5, Part 11, has a very interesting section I'd recommend to everybody on the arts of the tyrant. And he summarizes those arts, those techniques, in under three headings by which he preserves his power. Firstly, the humiliation of his subjects. Quote, "He knows that a mean-spirited man will not conspire against anybody." This is what Catholic thinkers call the massification of the population, in which the people, true, organic, traditional people, are gradually replaced by the masses. that are inert in themselves and can only be moved from without, as we've seen. Number 2, the tyrant creates mistrust among them. For a tyrant is not overthrown until men begin to have confidence in one another, till there are those social bonds. And this is the reason why tyrants are at war with the good. Not only because they would not be ruled despotically, but also because they are loyal to one another, good men, and to other men, and do not inform against one another. So this is the social division caused by the progressive loss of Catholic unity in the formerly Christian nations of the West. Added to today the immigration avalanches, the importing of foreign populations, the promotion of all kinds of conflicts and dialectics and ideologies to divide people, between Zoomers and Boomers, between men and women, between blacks and whites, between working class and bourgeois. All of these conflicts are stoked by the tyrant. Number 3, the tyrant desires that his subject shall be incapable of action, for no one attempts what is impossible, and they will not attempt to overthrow a tyranny if they are powerless. The most obvious one of this, I suppose, to start with, is to make them poor. Involve them in such great deeds they can never finish them. This method is what Belloc called the servile state, and it complements the first one we saw regarding massification. The financial system, of course, assumes a leading role here, since it is primarily through the mismanagement of finances, that a society is achieved in which people can only have as their sole mental horizon the struggle to earn a living, thus leaving the usurping tyrant undisturbed. Next slide. What you see here are some rather manipulated and flawed diagrams of media bias and trustworthiness. But this is interesting and useful, I think, for understanding this notion of epistemic sovereignty. So why is it the mass gives such credibility and authority to what is on BBC News? You see here on the left, unfortunately this one's America focused, but that part at the sort of top of the mountain is the sort of most credible, most authoritative organs of media in the minds of the average secular person. So you have Reuters there, you have AP News, BBC, CNN. People see that and they think, okay, this is a real event that I really have to care about. And then that sort of descends as it gets more partisan, left and right. You can see there in the centre there. That's sort of where the centre, who gets to define the centre, by the way? That in itself implies a kind of sovereignty. So I should say counterfeit sovereignty, because of course only God is sovereign. But in liberal political thought, sovereignty is from the people. And that ultimate authority can be questioned, has to be identified where it is, where it lies. The German thinker Carl Schmitt has received increasing attention recently, is increasingly in vogue for looking at this idea of sovereignty, where it comes from in a liberal regime which has ostensibly got this dissipated authority that's amongst each one of us as sovereign voters. And he basically gives 2 tests for locating sovereignty, which is very helpful. So firstly, he says, sovereign is he who defines the exception. So if there's a norm, for example, freedom of association, but then that freedom of association is taken away, for example, during lockdowns, he who was able to enact that exception is sovereign. Of course, that wasn't the Westminster Parliament. I mean, instrumentally it was, but ultimately that was coming from directives that were coming from the World Health Organization and international institutions. So that was a revelatory moment. The other test that Schmitt gives is to look at who gets to tell us the story of who our friends and enemies are. And this, I think, is more profound. Those institutions in the centre that get to define the sort of epistemic consciousness of the masses are those who uphold modern mythologies, because man is a religious animal. All men are religious animals. And so those media institutions derive their credibility and their authority from their priestly safeguarding of these modern mythologies. What are these modern mythologies? Well, there's many of them. First of all is the mythology of democracy. So it's this flattery of the citizenry by the tyrant. Another is the black legends against Christendom. So it's a negative mythology. It's a mythology of original sin, you might say. The wicked Christian social order. There's other parts to it as well. Evolution is very critical. It's a topic that's been addressed here because that bestializes man, brings him down into the order of irrational animals. Holocaustianity, of course, is a real sacred narrative which is patrolled by the regime. Progress, this idea of progress, this notion which was Christianized, you might say, by Teilhard de Chardin in a heretical way. Those are, I think, at a base, inchoate, foundational level, what give these organs their legitimacy, their credibility. Next slide, please. So we're going to take this view that the media is strong, that it's important, as I've indicated there. Dr. Douglas Haugen notes that the oligarchs do indeed view media as strong. That's why they invest so much resources into it. That's why they put news panels on the sides of motorways and in government waiting rooms and throughout your day. It's very difficult to avoid news media. And Pius XII confirmed this. He said of the radio, quote, "This method of communication is such that it is, as it were, detached from and unrestricted by conditions of place and time, which block or delay all other methods of communication between men. On winged flight, swifter than sound waves, it passes with the speed of light over all frontiers and delivers the news committed to it. Those words which are written in Scripture can be applied to radio, and today to the internet and social media. With it we bless God the Father, and with it we curse men, who are made after the likeness of God, out of the same mouth, blessing and cursing," end quote. So in the 20th century, there was this new set of sciences. I'm not going to go into in depth. If you'd like to find out more, there is a series of documentaries by Adam Curtis available on YouTube on the manufacturing of public consent. And he examines there, in particular, two figures, Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, who were American media executives and consultants in the 20th century who developed these techniques that, when used through media, can, they claim, convince anybody of anything. And it's like a hypodermic needle. So it's information that penetrates and has that psychological effect, even without feeling the prick on the skin. So you can manufacture, if you're an oligarch, majority will. This is what we now call PR. Through images, you can shape society how you want. Most people, of course, just want to follow the ideas given to them by authority, quote unquote. And it wasn't an accident, I think, that this refined form of media manipulation really was pioneered in the United States of America, and also in Britain to an extent. These are Protestant cultures, and they are based on this idea that anybody can read and interpret the Bible. There is this individual sovereignty already latent in the Protestant heresies. They're literate, critical cultures, and the print culture was particularly potent there. Next slide, please. This cartoon depicts something called yellow journalism, which was named after a cartoon character in the Gilded Age in America in the 1890s. This was the time at which news was nationalized. So I talked before about how the newspaper's structural meta-political purpose was to strengthen the nation state. And this was when it really accelerated in the United States. There was a fierce competition, allegedly, between this cartoon character, William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's World, West and East Coast. And this led to the development of these techniques of yellow journalism, which won readers over through sensationalism, sex, crime, graphic horrors, all these forms of manipulation with tabloidization, which we're familiar with today. Circulation reached 1 million copies a day in this period, and the journalism opened the way to mass circulation newspapers that depended on advertising revenue. This sensationalist and jingoistic press coverage was then used to incite public opinion, public support, for the Spanish-American War in 1898, which is sort of America's first, actually it wasn't, but in this imperial period, it's America's first imperial war to remove that last bit of Catholic power in the Western Hemisphere. Jacques Ellul writes, quote, "An opinion cannot form itself in entire societies unless mass media of communication exists. This much is evident. Without the mass media, there can be no modern propaganda. But we must point to a dual factor necessary if the mass media is really to become an instrument of propaganda. They must be subject to centralized control on the one hand and well diversified with regard to their products on the other. When film production, the press, and radio transmission are not centrally controlled, no propaganda is possible. As long as a large number of independent news agencies, newsreel producers, and diverse local papers function, no conscious and direct propaganda is possible." So despite this dialectic between different media moguls, they still have that underlying unified purpose. The first time the masses become involved in foreign policy. Prior to this, people are involved in their localities, and this incites an addiction to news. So I think that's quite a good place to pause before we turn to more modern times. So thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. This section of my talk, the second part, will end with some notes of hope. So do endure. There are some prescriptions that I'm going to propose. So this is Edward Bernays here, student of Sigmund Freud. He understood that people's preferences and tastes could be shaped, that desire and acquisitiveness, avarice, could be stimulated. And that could be done by outside forces that people had not considered or seen. This is the beginning of consumer culture, particularly in the 1920s in America. Consumer credit, advertising, the manufacturing of desire. So on the other side of the Second World War, particularly in America, but in this country as well, the imperative given through media is also shop, shop, shop. And the flip side to that is the Red Scare, the kind of implication that the Soviets are going to take all this away from you. So there's that introduction of fear, the fear of loss, which makes the public just more moldable to the oligarch class. Those two vices, those two emotions that the devil loves to play on, fear and greed, the two main sort of strings that he pulls. And this is what his minions were utilizing. With the development of the motion pictures by the 1980s, we get 24-hour news, cable news in the US. You wonder, with this development, how much news is there out there to show all day long? We're going to talk later about the quantity of media, how this is really important. But of course, it correlates with declining quality. And it has a paralyzing effect. The masses are less and less able to discern what is true and what is false. And they come to love their servitude. So those two pernicious tendencies in this post-war period of individualism and statism, the background dialectic of the Cold War, were particularly important. This international division between the liberal capitalist individualist world and the Soviet communist statist world actually belied a certain convergence of both tendencies, which occurred thanks to principally the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. Despite the diverse antagonism, supposedly, between both blocs, this movement of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s represented a moment of clear fusion and synthesis of both tendencies. Through a complex system of mass media and seemingly more subtle mechanisms, a powerful influence was exerted to shape the hearts and minds of nations through appealing to base appetites. And it's no wonder that the crisis of the church, which continues and deepens to this day, crystallized precisely within this historical context. The weakness of societies, as we've seen, their massification, allowed the penetration of liberal and modernist heresies, undermining the capacity for spiritual and moral resistance in this moment of revolutionary transformation. Next slide, please. So, talking of fear, we can think about how threat perceptions are shaped by mass media. Once that suggestibility is created in the audience through fear, it can make it easier to get them to do what you want. And that's what the producers of the media want them to do. So this is from 10 years ago. It's a little bit dated, but I would imagine that it's quite representative of how it is today. So you can see here on the column on the left how people in the US really die, 60% heart disease or cancer. Google searches are a little bit more dramatic, with suicide, terrorism, diabetes being overrepresented. And then media coverage is just way out on terrorism, suicide, and homicide. And this is what William Hearst, who was one of those media moguls we looked at earlier, said: if it bleeds, it leads. Some things don't change, and nothing bleeds like war. Next slide, please. Here's the instrumental purpose: the Cold War context, the establishment of a permanent security state, particularly in the United States, and then those other vassals of the United States, the American Empire, like Britain, followed in its wake. The permanent intelligence agencies, these states within the state, the deep states, which are completely blocked, completely hidden from democracy, even looking into them. The Cold War, black budgets, since 1947, justifying mass surveillance and institutionalized breaking of the law. So quite clearly, the CIA, in having this vast black budget that's never been audited by Congress, is directly contradictory, violating of the US Constitution about monies being needed to be made accountable to Congress of the receipts and expenditures of all public money. The Fourth Amendment, about the warrants needed for seizures of papers and effects, against unlawful searches and seizures, this vast form of tyrannical overreach. But actually, it's not something new in the American context. In 1798, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, and this was in the context of a kind of quasi-war with France, and also looking back to the old colonial power of Britain. And that legislation made it illegal to print, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States, end quote, which of course directly contradicted the First Amendment within the time period of its actual ratification. And that legislation was the legal justification for other constitutional overreaches that have followed, like the internment of Japanese and German Americans during the Second World War, Lincoln's imprisonment of Southern sympathizers without trial during the American Civil War, the Patriot Act, and so on and on and on. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to John Norval in 1807, where he said, quote, "To your request of my opinion of the manner in which a newspaper should be conducted so as to be most useful, I should answer by restraining it to true facts and sound principles only. Yet I fear such a paper would find few subscribers. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. I really look with commiseration over the great body of my fellow citizens who, reading newspapers, live and die in the belief they have known something of what has been passing in the world in their time." End quote. That's 1807. Next slide, please. So Charles mentioned he was too young to remember this, but this was quite formative in my youth. And in university, I went to King's College London, studied war studies. Several of the professors had links with the Defence College at Shrivenham and the sort of military deep states within this country. And I clearly remember one of the lecturers who was advising some of the British military personnel at the time during the war in Afghanistan, the insurgency then. He told us how this bombing of Baghdad in 2003 was purposefully done at night so that it looked better on American television sets. So you could see that there's always this consciousness of media presentation. Next slide, please. So these are some of the neurolinguistic techniques which, I'm sure you all will have noticed. Warfare makes them very acute. The propaganda becomes very obvious. So just recently with the Iran war, just the way in which the headline is presented in a way to obviously favour the synagogue and the Jewish state, to occlude and cloud the mind of the general public about the responsibility of Israel's war crimes. Next slide, please. This is an interesting one. So by doing things like this, I think what they're doing is one reason they're doing it is to create an artificial search engine void. So this is very much like today's context. They're burying the truth in the text so that historically you won't actually be able to look back and see that search engine data about Israeli war crimes. It's interesting, the kind of cutting edge at the moment. Another thing is photo banks. You've probably noticed how it's quite difficult to get historical images which aren't bought up already by Alamy and these other photo bank corporations. And I think that's a way to control the memory, to curate the memory of these events as we move forward. Next slide, please. The oligarchs are interested in creating monopolies, and there's no more powerful monopoly than a monopoly on information. The US media corporations, I'm sure you're aware, 90% are controlled by just 6 companies, we can see here. Next slide, please. And this reinforces the political dialectic, which I talked a little bit about in my Kabbalistic, my lecture on the Kabbalah and its Kabbalistic dialectics. The growth of GB News as Reform UK TV is, I think, Americanizing this space in this country at the moment. And of course, it brings forward that theatrical stage play of democracies where the ruling minorities conquer the empty state and they occupy the positions of power there, holding the reins of power. They can only do so by deceiving and persuading the masses that the masses, possess all the power, when in reality they are deprived of the essential power of decision and direction. So whatever we vote for, the outcome is the same. Taxes rise while money inflates, freedoms shrink, culture is debased, public morals attacked, communities, what remain of them, are gradually dissolved. Changing parties is like changing the actors on stage while the script remains the same. As Peter Hitchens points out, liberal political parties, which is all of them, are not there to represent the people to the elite, they are there to represent the elite to the people. Elections are the greatest bread and circuses of them all, of course, are a mainstay for 24-hour news programs. This is bigger than football or soap operas. It's a spectacle to pacify the people while their property, their culture, their homeland is plundered by rapacious oligarchs. It's globalist liberalism, anti-Christianity, destruction of Christian civilization, ultimately at the service of anti-Christendom, preparing the way for the coming of the man of perdition. Next slide. This network was produced by a leftist think tank, DSMOG, but nevertheless it has some very interesting sort of graphics like this, which I think map out the sort of media nexus of the right wing of the power structure in this country, the way in which it's transatlantic. You've got 55 Tufton Street down there in the bottom right. We're probably, many of us here, like 1 or 2 degrees of separation from people that work there in the think tanks, just down the road. Next slide, please. This one here, there's some figures here which Augustin Virgil critiques in his bestseller. And for example, Sir Paul Marshall there in the top right is an interesting one. He apparently worships at Holy Trinity Brompton, which is the home of the Alpha Course, an evangelical Church of England conventicle next door to the Brompton Oratory. It's quite interesting. He's got all sorts of connections, owning The Spectator, Unheard, major stakes in GB News, this ecosystem that's forming a kind of new populist consensus behind reform. But his own financial ventures began with seed money from George Soros. And all of his media organs relentlessly critique the Soros ecosystem. So what is going on here? But it's fluid and it's kind of bewildering to keep track of. This all constitutes the Washington or Westminster consensus. They're the same thing. Liberal managerialism. So mass protests, all it does is use to manufacture consent for this power center. Remember the sort of top of the media ecosystem. The mass protests against the Iraq War, millions of people in the streets, which it's been demonstrated does nothing if the power center disagrees. The bottom right there is a quote from Tony Blair talking about the consensus around aberrosexualism. I think it's quite revealing. So he says, building a consensus for change was the key priority. So there was no demand for LGBT rights, quote unquote. It had to be built. Obviously, otherwise the public, the mass, had zero interest in it. This is the manufactured consensus that is created by these media techniques. The idea of a large-scale peaceful protest is a myth. All they do is hold a sign and then go home. It's an empty performance, a show. The permanent agenda continues. Next slide, please. What we're seeing more and more is this sort of securitization of the media space with the more open control of those Five Eyes security agencies, which are themselves deeply Masonic, the way in which security classifications work, the different levels. In-Q-Tel is not there. That is, In-Q-Tel is the CIA's venture capital firm. And evidence has emerged about how this provided a lot of the seed funding for the kind of Silicon Valley success stories of Google Earth, Facebook, Instagram. I've heard from several people working in the technology sector that these technology giants were given the access and the bandwidth, the space on the internet, which is ultimately originally a US government, US military venture, through a quid pro quo by which the intelligence services would have a back door into all of their data. The myth around these things starting in Californian garages is just that. It's just a myth. It was all manufactured. And the US intelligence services have been increasingly open. Since that's 2011 in the top left, that they've been looking to work within social media. This is the new frontier, or increasingly important frontier for media manipulation, but it's the same techniques that we saw from the newspaper, radio, and television. 77th Brigade is the UK equivalent that's been operating actually since at least about 2006. It was born out of the counterinsurgency framework pushed by David Betts and other pet regime academics. David Betts actually was a professor of war studies at King's College London. And they turned, you're not a counterinsurgency expert unless there's an insurgency. So it's in your interests to talk about an insurgency. They treated the British public as an insurgent force during lockdowns. A show was made of the use of military intelligence in combating disinformation, part of which involved the discrediting of stories around vaccine risk during a time when young people, who are now proven to be the group at risk of mRNA vaccine heart damage, were under coercive pressure to take this experimental serum. This is the kind of level of evil of the delinquents that rule us. In 2025, so just last year, a police unit in England was admitted to monitoring online signs of anti-migrant disorder. This is the formalised permanent use of the 77th Brigade on the UK population to keep the boat people here. The MI5 takeover of policing moves forward. This next slide is the permanent agenda that the Vatican is also on board with and driving forward. It's worth remembering whenever the media points to particular scarecrows like Sadiq Khan, who is a sort of a hate figure on the right, in implementing his 20-mile-an-hour speed limits and congestion zones and ULEZ and so on. He is just implementing the statutory obligations of the Conservative passed Climate Change Act. So when they set up their little Tweedledum and Tweedledee theatre, just remember that this is just a legal obligation that he's fulfilling, that they're both on board with as a result of this. Thank you. So we can talk about media quantity now. This is what Steve Bannon called flooding the zone, the sea of noise. I'm minded of Macbeth's soliloquy upon hearing the death of Lady Macbeth. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. There was a quotation back in 2007 about the online boards that posting on 4chan is just urinating in a sea of urine. And the research has been done into the origins, the IP addresses of some of the language, the coarsening and degrading memes and culture that originates on those boards. The IP address often are sourced in Israel. So this is the kind of internet Zoomer culture being shaped by the enemies of the church. As the volume of online interaction goes up, think about Indian bot accounts and so on, how this is more and more obvious, the value of each interaction goes down. It's just obvious. So think about how, for example, Epstein is passé now. He's in the background noise of microchip vaccines and lizard people. He's become like 9/11 or JFK. John Sweeney writes, quote, "In modern Western democracies, the politically engaged masses exist in the sea of worry. Their reality is one of constant anxiety about drastic events beyond their control and outside the scope of their everyday lives," end quote. So here's the first solution that I'm going to point to. What we need is a restoration of a political vista which is proportionate to man's nature. This globalized world that the regime is orientating us towards is always disproportionate to our nature as local and social animals. And so what we can do is restore a proper proportionate nature which we can actually deal with. What this also does, flooding the zone, is mean that the background noise of decline is kept out of the headlines. To take a couple of examples, green farm policy has been announced which will lead to a 10% reduction in livestock numbers in Wales, according to the Welsh Government's own research. This will cause millions in losses, thousands of jobs, all in the name of the managerial state. Yearly abortion figures reached a record high last year, more than 300,000. 72% of them were at home. So there's this constant degradation, decomposition that's going on, and this just masks it. Next slide, please. The news cycle, as you've probably noticed, has an increasing velocity, which again makes it disproportionate. That American pilot in Iran story, do you notice how quickly that disappeared? It's just getting quicker and quicker. And you contrast that, I recall, in 2007, the Madeleine McCann story. It was just saturation on every single front page for months. The Daily Telegraph described her disappearance as the most heavily reported missing person case in modern history. Placing Madeleine on the front page of a British newspaper would sell up to 30,000 extra copies. She appeared on the front page of several British tabloids every day for almost 6 months and was one of Sky News' menu options: UK News, Madeleine, World News. that's something to tell, obviously, what the regime is looking to promote. So we shouldn't listen to what they say, but we should look at what they want us to think about things. That's the only reason to look at mainstream media. So, of course, the BBC have these tabs that correspond to sort of current things. So they'll have climate change. The coronavirus one, I think, just quietly dropped away. They never announce an end to the pandemic, but it just quietly disappears. The Iran war probably has one now. So that's what the oligarchs want us to pay attention to. What is the point of this news cycle din, this increasing velocity, why it's getting faster and faster? John Sweeney says, quote, "This constant barrage of suddenly amplified and then suddenly hidden tragedies with warring narrative interpretation creates a news cycle din. A crowd of voices reacting to awful events pumped directly into your eyeballs by all forms of media. Everything from drugs, misogyny, gender ideology, mental health, gun control, religion, violence in media, school spending, teacher training, school security, internet censorship will be invoked in these conversations. The liberal exchange of ideas is a self-cancelling din." And this is the warning that Pope Gregory XVI made all the way back in the 1830s about the dangers of freedom of speech and freedom of publication, the fact that this notion, this liberal notion that everyone has something worthy of saying in public. This becomes a saturated space where discussion of the failure of our elites and the centuries of decline they have overseen would itself occupy it. It covers and replaces that. The Axel Ruda-Cabana news in the top right, that was in January 10th, 2025. The release of that information was timed to coincide with Trump's inauguration and was lost in the din of political news and conversation, both at home and abroad. Releasing information into a crammed news day with bigger headlines works well for the regime. That's something they do more and more. Next slide, please. Okay, I won't go too much into this, but this is sort of the magical technique that's taking place behind this. Hyperreality is where the representation of something is taken to be more real than the reality itself. Images take precedence over reality, becoming more real in people's perception. And when you study, when you look at various magical techniques, it's not really about changing objective nature, because that's going against God's laws. It's more about changing the perceptions of the subjects. A form of idolatry then is procured that denies the fundamental nature of reality. John Baudrillard says, "People seek happiness and fulfillment through the simulacra of reality and avoid interaction with the real world. It is no longer reality that produces simulated copies, but the copies themselves that have shaped and defined what is considered real." So, for example, if you show an American a picture of Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, they might say, "Oh, that's a copy of the Disney castle." They've confused, and the copy, the image has become more real to them than the original. That's quite an inane example, but of course there are many more serious examples, the way in which people look to celebrities as sort of embodying certain characters they've played on screen, for example. Dr. Haugen writes, quote, the church upholds the sacramental order, where signs faithfully transmit the essence of the signified, maintaining the ontological order of reality. In the Johannine literature, in the Bible, Christ is revealed to be the Logos that unifies the Platonic forms into an eternal word. The Byzantine iconoclasm period was resolved in 843 at the local council of Constantinople, which affirmed the veneration of icons. Of course, the Catechism of Trent once again presents the Church's teaching that there are certain signs appointed by God with the power not only to signify but also to accomplish. These are the sacraments of the new law. Marshall McLuhan's famous maxim, "The medium is the message," implies that in the age of mass media, full immersion and saturation in the realm of electronic impulses becomes the focus of all messages. This is something that Augustine Virgil gets across in his book, that it almost doesn't matter what the content of the messages are. It's just that you're paying attention to them. It's just punters in the stalls. That's what they want. And this corresponds to Baudrillard's orbital model of simulation, where references vanish and only the self-referentiality of the spectacle remains. John Ralston Saul, in his book Voltaire's Bastards, writes, quote, "The death of God, combined with the perfection of the image, has brought us to a whole new state of expectation. The electronic image is man as God, and the ritual involved leads us not to a mysterious Holy Trinity, but back to ourselves. These images cannot help but return to the expression of magic and fear proper to idolatrous societies." So that's BBC News on 4th of October 2025. You can see the entire news cycle subsumed by the petty squabbles of 0.5% of the UK population. On that day, it was quite literally BBC Jews. You had to go through 5 stories on the front page before you reach a story that was not about that 0.5% of their population, of our population, and their genocidal state. So things in media hyperreality only exist when they're being talked about. Buying into the news cycle involves a lack of political object permanence. For most people, they weren't talking about Mohammedan rape gangs, so they stopped existing. When the story goes away, people forget what it was again. Charlie Kirk is another example. There's a sort of conspiracy as titillation. The President of the United States directly announcing Charlie Kirk's death on social media, and him announcing the capture of his suspected killer on Fox and Friends. This is online hyperreality blending with 24-hour news. Those techniques, those stages we've looked at, being perfected, being synthesized as time goes on. And then, of course, this is all deeply humiliating, and it's intended to be. Endless Iraq war inquiries, the Chilcot inquiry reported in 2016. Of course, the actual solution isn't really politically possible to speak about. The laws are in place, hence the endless conversation. Next slide, please. We'll skip this slide. It's just more, and this one as well. Augustine Virgil has made an interesting point that our contemporary public discourse has come to resemble more and more the Talmud, the Talmudization of public discourse. If you look into what the Talmud is, what it consists of, this vast rabbinic literature, where for every statement there's a counter-statement, this dialectical mode of thought. It's, of course, completely opposite to the Western Catholic and classical thought. It's dynamic, multifaceted. It has no magisterium, no dogmas. That's why it's difficult to say, well, in the Talmud it says that Gentile souls are produced of a lower animal substance to Jewish souls. It does say that, but the Jew can always turn around and say, yeah, but then the next rabbi contradicts that. So they don't have that magisterial teaching in that way. And people get it wrong when they try to see Jewish thought through classical lens. But this is something that, this rabbinic squabbling that never ends in a resolution is characteristic of our modern media. As society becomes more and more Judaized, it takes on more and more of this character. Contradiction becomes the foundation of modern dialectical thinking. Jewish thought is profoundly restless, and that's the perfect word for the modern media. In Catholic societies, you rest in the truth, and you go about the business of leading a sacramental life with your family, in your community, in your homeland, in your locale, and you don't need to worry about what the truth is. You have it and you have to live it. Whereas this mode, this new mode, the endless din, is the modern Talmudization of the media. Next slide. If you look at the media storm that occurred after Watergate versus the deafening silence after the Epstein's files release, let's recall that Ehud Barak personally emailed Epstein Epstein was sending emails about nice torture videos and so on. You can't get more Mossad linked than Ehud Barak, and therefore should be one of the biggest stories in recent history, you'd think. But of course, nothing will happen, and that tells you everything. Sweeney says, quote, Epstein becoming slop that people tune out is a very clear example of why what is no longer revelation is normalization. Initially, the window into the world of the very apex of the elite and celebrity world was revelatory to many. The stretching out of these revelations through numerous fake-outs, teases. Saw Melania Trump gave a public speech yesterday, sort of bringing it back into the public conscious, but with no resolution, just keeping that conversation going. Continuous releases neuter the power of these revelations. Even the most explosive revelations, when repeated, but not resolved, become numbing. Nothing being resolved is key to learned helplessness. We know about the Mohammedan rape gangs. Many sort of regime right-wingers are pretending to have just found out about this. And they're saying that the answer is to beg the same managerial machine which carried out this atrocity for the remedy, to investigate itself. When people are presented with a problem designed not to be solved, the psychological conclusion of that for most people is to give up on the problem and think of it as unsolvable. The more time the problem is raised and solved, the more likely this is to happen. It is normalized. Vincente Evangelista has talked about a certain type of pornography of indignation, which by inciting irascible appetite, public indignation, encourages polarization within the liberal frame and a feeling of anarchy. The idea introduced is that the decomposition of society is being televised and you can't do anything about it. Situations like this only transmit hopelessness and exasperate an already frustrated population. For us Catholics, it's necessary to point out problems directly and propose solutions without falling into cheap alarmism. Next slide, please. So, one solution, one very important solution, is to have our own forms of Catholic media. And the popes have been quite eloquent on this. Pius XII said, quote, in all its actions and conduct, the Catholic press must present an insurmountable obstacle to the progressive decline and disappearance of the fundamental conditions for a healthy public opinion, and consolidate and even strengthen what remains of it. I think an allusion there to the Book of the Apocalypse. It must willingly renounce the empty gains of vulgar self-interest or ill-gotten popularity. It must remain, with energetic and resolute dignity, inaccessible to all direct or indirect attempts at corruption. It must have the courage, even at the cost of financial sacrifices, to relentlessly remove from its pages any advertisement or publicity that is injurious to the faith or to morals. By acting in this way, it will gain intrinsic value, eventually winning esteem and then trust, and justifying the oft-repeated motto, in every Catholic home, the Catholic newspaper. Next slide. They want our engagement, so don't give it to them. That's obvious. They want our emotional investment, so don't give it to them. They want our subscriptions, so don't give it to them. So what can we do? Well, if we think back to how this manipulation began, this programmatic manipulation, in my view, restoration must begin pre-politically. It must begin locally. Necessarily beginning with the reinvigoration of the family, beginning with our own, with parental authority, with fatherly authority, with the restoration of our patrimony, cultural and religious. It involves building neighborly relations, family gatherings. It involves trying to solidify professional relationships and any number of political and pre-political tasks. It is the painstaking work of nurturing what is in its infancy, of gradually straightening what is crooked, of restoring what has been ruined. It is the small work of finding those remnants of a people so that we can increase them. The task of founding and nurturing families, of being visible and finding those who react constructively against the revolution. I believe that today politics is impossible. That's the subject for another talk. But the pre-political localist action we must do is relevant for being resilient to media manipulation. We must reconstitute Catholic peoples. St. Augustine points to the only antidote to the idolatry of the image, which is the real presence of the Holy Eucharist. The body and blood of Christ represents a true connection between the signifier and the signified. Beholding and uniting with the Lamb of God in the Eucharist is the transformative alternative to the illusions and idolatry of hyperreality. Oscar Mendes says, quote, "The Catholic city is not a nostalgia, it is a duty, not as an historical form, but as a concrete expression of the eternal principle that must govern history. Order is not invented, it is received. Every attempt at political restoration without God is doomed to failure, but so too is every attempt at theological restoration without political implications. The Holy Spirit demands incarnation, not only in the soul of the believer, but also in the body of the community. The Catholic city will be real if the Spirit is recognized as its invisible principle, not as a symbol, but as a reality. And when that happens, though enemies may mock and those in power resist, the city will revive. For where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, and there is also justice, hierarchy, law, homeland, and altar." Thank you for listening.